Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you so much for inviting me. Um, I'm really happy to be here and to present the book with everyone. And um, I wrote this book in my third year of my MFA program at Syracuse, and and I was supposed to be working on my poetry dissertation at the time, but my poetry is very autobiographical, and so it became very hard because a lot of difficult emotions were raised while I was working on the poetry. So to take a break from that, I decided to write. I just thought I needed to write a fun fantasy project. Just and um, and at the time the pandemic was happening, and so it was a very difficult time. But this project brought me a lot of joy, and I'm excited to share. Um, I'm just gonna I'm gonna read some short passages um, from the beginning that I feel like read more as poetry, and so they are not really humans. They are figments of a life taking corporal shape. Ghosts. That is why I have never left the mansion. I am real. I am a person who Father, in his ancient and wondrous way, saved from the brink of death and brought here to the world in between, where the collector of souls cannot reach me. I have no memory of my life before I was saved. I am too grateful to betray Father by clinging to the past. We are privileged as two humans in a world of myth. This is what Father has told me. I hear them. Every night I hear them. Come out, they say. The roof rattles. My bed shakes. Wind pushes against the walls. Their voices are gentle and soft. They can give me what I want. Love, companionship. The emptiness in me echoes. Like a bell, I am struck. I do not give in. I know the promise of love exists only as a tool for deception. They need a soul to feel their own life. The soul must come willingly. Obedience out of fear taints the act. The illusion of beauty cannot be maintained. The fields shred themselves. I have a mind of my own. I choose solitude. I choose freedom. The ghosts have no control over me. And then this last excerpt about the ghosts. Thunder crashes and lightning splits the sky. It starts to rain, and I know that is a sign. More ghosts are coming from the world of the living. The rain delivers their souls into this world, suffusing the soil with the smell and taste of iron. That is why the sky wails and wails. The rain is so heavy. Many souls are passing over tonight. Many eyes in the world above us are closing forever. I imagine the living asking the souls to come back. Those calls must stay alive inside the ghost. They are what drives them to drastic action in this world. I hear a dripping sound. I turn around and see that the roof is leaking. The rain is coming in. And yeah, that's the that's the final excerpt from the beginning. And in the beginning, um, I son is very closed off. He has lived in the mansion for his entire life with father, and so his voice is very is very deranged almost. He um and and his point of view from about the ghosts are just very skewed in this uh difficult way. And I think the challenge of the book was was me trying to get Sun to expand his worldview more and try to get him to see that the ghosts are human too and are not just these figments of his fears and anxieties. And so when Sun does eventually leave the mansion and travels around the ghost world, he meets the what I call the oldest ghost in their realm, and he talks to this ghost and just learns more about them. And what surprised me about writing this was I started off with just the premise of two humans in a world of ghosts, but then this book ended up turning out to be about family and the difficult relationships that we have with the people we love. And the eldest ghost gives her a point of view on what family is to her. And you want to be human again, don't you? Isn't that what you all want? I ask. Madame draws her head back and laughs. I cross my arms. Her fascination with father and me feels more and more intrusive as we talk. I am a specimen for her to study. We are not so different, she says. I've often asked these questions myself. I am the oldest entity in this region. I came into this world as an adult, and I am the only one among my peers who has stayed here. I didn't care for my past life, and when the possibility to move on from this world arrived, I refused. I wanted to continue to suffer. The complexities that loneliness and regret weave into existence are of great interest to me. I've been around for so long, and yet I still find things to be surprised by, like you and your father. How utterly fascinating the devotion you two show each other. I once had a child myself. I found it very easy to give him up. Did you hurt him? I asked. In a way, yes. He arrived in this world shortly after I did. He must have been around your age. To be honest, I had no evidence that he was my child. I didn't have any memories of him. And yet I was possessed by a sense of certainty. He must have approached every ghost in this region, asking if he were his mother. I couldn't bring myself to answer him. I kept my distance. The kind of love he was asking for terrified me. I couldn't bear someone needing me that desperately. It was a love that belonged to the land of the living. Eventually, a ghost answered his call. He said that he was his mother and he took him in, and they created a small family. But how could he believe her? I asked. I would never accept anyone but father. You're right. Perhaps he didn't believe her, but that's the thing about kindness. When someone decides to give it to you unconditionally, it's hard to push them away. And they made a great family. They were very happy with each other, which meant they moved on quickly from this world. And so I was satisfied with my decision. If I hadn't stayed away, then I might have ruined their chance at peace. And I was able to pursue the eternity that I desired alone. I tell her how horrifying that is. What is that we can't recognize the people we love, she says. No, that you abandoned him. You let him live a lie. Madame frowns. I shake my head. Why was I born here? Isn't it obvious, she says. You're here to dissuade the ghosts from wanting to return to the land of the living. You're here to remind them how fearful and angry they were in their previous lives. You and your father possess a keen sense of death. Humans like you are always thinking about him, seeking him out. If you follow that instinct and manage to find the entrance to this world while they are still alive, they find the river where all are tested, and if deemed worthy, are escorted to this side. Their arrival is a joyous vacation to me. So I'm going to read just one final section. And while I was writing this book, even though it's not autobiographical and it draws on a lot of fantasy elements and poetic elements, I realized that I just kept referring to experiences I had gone through, and there's a part in this book where the father I made this choice to, but the father chooses to isolate himself in a basement. He just chooses to lock himself in a basement. And it's very disturbing to the narrator's son because his father has always been a very strong person in this world. And then for some reason, suddenly he chooses to isolate himself. And one of my readers, he asked me, why did I choose to do that? Why did I make the father so weak in the end? And I didn't know. I didn't know why at the time. I just felt very strongly that this had to happen. That I just couldn't get away from the image of the father being locked in a basement. And then it was months later when I kept reflecting, when I kept trying to revise, that I realized that I was being influenced by past experiences with my family, because I think my grandma died of lung cancer, and my father, he was diagnosed with bladder cancer. So it medical so cancer runs in our family a lot. And when my grandmother passed away from cancer, she was living in Vietnam. And so my mother and I, we left America and we returned to Vietnam for 2 weeks. And when we were back in Vietnam, my grandmother, since it was since there was no more treatment to go through, it was the end. My grandmother just stayed in this small room in our mountain in their home in the mountain village in Vietnam. And so she was in that room, and I was staying in the attic. I was staying in the attic right above that room, and I would since I would always hear her breathing because she has to breathe through a nasal cannula with an oxygen. And so she kept herself in the room, and I would be in the attic listening to her breathe. And then the 2 weeks went by, and my mother returned back to Kansas because her vacation days were over, and he had to return to back to work at the aircraft factory. I stayed in Vietnam. I stayed in Vietnam after the 2 weeks still, and the day after my mother returned to America, that day. The day after she left was when my grandmother passed away. It was a strange. My grandmother passed away one day after my mother returned to America, and we carry out the funeral, and it's something I don't think about a lot because it's a very weird situation that gets caught up that in immigration, and there's so many factors. But another strange part of that is I carry out the funeral in Vietnam with my relatives, but my mother, since she was in Kansas, she watched the funeral on her iPad. I'm laughing about now because it's just because the world is so strange. It's so weird. She watched the funeral on her iPad, and my mother, she's crying while she's watching the funeral, but she is also recording. She's using her phone to record the video footage on her iPad while she's crying because she doesn't know how to record the footage through her iPad. So it's such a weird situation, and it's so complex. But I have But real life is very strange, and I have a much harder time writing about that directly. My mind just goes blank. But when I write, but if but if I find a fantasy premise, or if I find this angle to write about these moments and these images and these feelings, it just comes more easily to me. And so that's my very long story of like why it was so important for me to um to have this image of father um falling apart and staying in the basement of the hotel, because it allowed me to work out these difficult emotions I had about my grandmother, and also when my father was diagnosed with cancer. So I'm going to read this last excerpt like this. So this excerpt, the father has locked himself in the basement, and son is going into it, and son wants to convince father to leave the basement and to be strong again. But he calls father the dark figure because he just can't accept that his father has become this weak. So that's why he uses the term dark figure a lot. Father shouts my name, and his happiness unsettles me. The lamp is to your right, he says. I find it, and when the light shines on the dark figure, I see how thin he has grown, how pale and weary his face has become. I place the meal next to him and say, have you been eating all your meals? If you don't like the food, I'm sure Madame can bring you something else. The food is fine. It's delicious. You should eat everything on the plate, I said. There's not a lot of it already. A bite or two isn't enough. You need your strength. I'm eating everything, I promise. I still have a big appetite. This is just from the lack of movement. I've lost some muscle mass. You have to get up and move around then. There's plenty of room. You're right, he says. I've just been tired. I get a little faint when I move around. Are you really father? I say, panicking, my breath caught in my throat. Why do you look like that? Of course I know. I'll start to move around soon. Then I'll be good as new. It's not hard to regain my strength. You're worrying too much. Spoonful of soup and feed it to him. He swallows and smiles. It's delicious. I'll have some more. I can feed myself. You can relax. It's my food. I'm an adult. I can do it on my own. As he eats the soup, I break the loaf of bread into tiny pieces. I cut up the apple and then worry that it might be too hard for him to chew. I remind myself to ask the cook to put grapes or orange slices on the tray instead of apples. The dark figure asks me how my stay at Madame's mansion has been. I said it has been great. I tell him how nice and thoughtful Madame has been. I tell him I've been working on the farm and have adjusted well. I am not afraid of the ghosts like I once was. I watch the dark figure's face carefully, trying to see if he shares the same memories as father. As my visit continues, he grows more tired. He lies on the ground, his face tenses, and his body stiffens. Then he smiles, and his eyes express deep sadness. He says, I can't protect anyone anymore. I've only been pretending to be strong. I've always been so scared. You can't be father. My father would never behave like this. Into his grave. You have to accept what has become. You can't change how Sakai. It is wrong to resist fate. Before I can respond, he crawls to a corner of the room and digs in the dirt. He pulls out a key and unlocks the shackles. He asks me to help him up, and we move into the alcove where the latrine is. He needs to squat over it, but his legs are too weak for him to stay in that position for too long. I hold him as he relieves himself. I close my eyes and hold my breath. I'm sorry, he says, his face heavy with shame. Time passes slowly. He leans onto my shoulder. My arm is wrapped tightly around his waist. Are your legs sore? I asked. Can I do anything else? I grab the toilet paper and help him wipe. I'm sorry, he says again, and I try to do a good job so he can feel clean and comfortable. We move back into the main room. He lies on the floor and I pull the shackles out of his reach. You have to put them on me, he says. You don't need them. You're already stuck in the room. They keep me safe from myself, he says. I don't want to ask you again. The dim light from the lamp deepens the lines on his face. I can sense his anger rising. I do not understand. I put the shackles on him and he says, thank you. I bury the keys near him and turn off the lamp and bring the tray back to the kitchen. I am surprised by how easily I can navigate the space now. Behind me, his voice rises and sobs, aching and full of remorse, as though he's talking to someone from his past. No, that cannot be father trapped down there, avoiding the world. That cannot be the person I have known. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nghiem, for that beautiful reading and for sharing the story about your family as well. I love this book so much. So it's just very special to hear you get to read from it, and from various parts that I loved. And I'm just really excited to get to ask you some questions about how this book came to be. Um, you mentioned that you started this book in your final year at Syracuse, where we met, and you were in the poetry program. And I'll just continue as you take a moment with my question. You were in the poetry program and you started this book almost as a way to, it sounded like, avoid writing poetry, and especially autobiographical poetry. And it was like a fun fantasy project. I'm curious, though, how poetry both influences this book in terms of like the line level, the imagery, because so much of it does read as poetry. And yet it sounded like it was a project that was born out of an avoidance of what you were supposed to be doing while in the MFA program. Could you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, it's strange. I think with poetry, image is so important. And so this did start from an image and of son running around the rooms in the house and the walls shaking because of the ghost. And so it started with the image um and then I could just hear the voice so clearly. And the voice, um I I think the I think the voice is so he's so confident at the beginning. The voice is just so confident in what he believes.
Mhm.
And Sun is so good at like protecting himself from any kind of emotional distress. He'll he can easily do his voice, just kind of tell himself these stories that will allow him to kind of move away from the the stressors. And I was just very impressed. I think I was just impressed because if I was living completely alone with only my father and like I had no friends, or I would fall into despair. But I love this narrator because he was just like, I'm not gonna fall into despair at all. I'm like, I love being alone. I love being in a world with only ghosts. I have all these books. So there was like this very intense optimism to him that I found clearly very delusional, but I found very impressive. And with the poetry I was writing, it was very clear eye. Like the poetry was more about just facing those moments head on and trying to draw out some kind of important truths from them and just trying to be very honest. And I really couldn't do that. It was very hard to revise in that manner. I just wanted to be more delusional, but but not unfortunately or fortunately, but due to the pressures of long-term narrative, just long-form narrative, I was just like, I just knew, oh, well, Sun can't be this delusional. Like he eventually does have to accept that his father is like weakening, and he has to accept that it is very difficult to be alone in the world, and he has to bend, and so eventually the things I was avoiding, the more difficult autobiographical emotions, they just came in because it's so important for growth in real life and in fiction. Like it, I wanted Sun to grow, and so I had to have him deal with these emotions that I was also dealing with.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think what I love so much about Sun's voice, you basically explained that he starts off so strong in I think you mentioned the word deranged and delusion. He's very firm in his beliefs, and then those start to shift. And we see in the beginning of the novel or the novella, I don't know if or a short novel, whatever we want to call it, that father is now beginning to assimilate into the world, and Sun is extremely resistant to that change. And throughout the book, we see Sun resisting and then bending, and then resisting and then bending. And there's this push and pull. And he's such a compelling narrator because we're so with him the entire time that the world that we understand is through Sun. And we get glimpses of like what the world might actually be through other characters who are speaking to Sun. Could you talk about how you managed creating the world and building it out through a narrator who, as I mentioned, and as you mentioned, is resisting trying to understand the world?
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. That was actually that was actually like the key element that I had to revise with my editor. This was this was very difficult to revise because in the first draft, my editor at Coffee House, she she felt like everything was too in his perspective. Like the world, she wanted to know a little more about the world, but since his point of view is so skewed, she couldn't tell like what was actually real in this world, like what were the rules of this fantasy world. So she really pushed me to one way and to really give the reader a glimpse of of what is actually really happening in the world versus what Sun's interpretation is. And one of the ways oh my gosh I'm one of the ways that the I think the key moment in that is just trying to portray the ghost in ways that do not align with what he thinks. So I think one important scene is when the ghosts do come into the house and he thinks that they're gonna take his body, and instead I try my best to show the ghost that's just like kind of just being nice, normal people, as much as I can, and having Sun wrestle with that, like why are they being so nice? And so again, just having, and then I also have father constantly try to tell Sun that like no, no, the ghosts are actually a lot more different than what you think they are. Like, because in the past, father kind of fed his beliefs, but now since the now with everything that's changing, I wanted father to be the source of reality and have and challenge son more. So the other goes father and us and all yeah. And then once he's out of the mansion and he's exploring the world more, then I was able to show more elements of the world that did not align with what he thought.
Yeah, I love how father is this source of outside information that like son really he wants to believe, but then he like also doesn't want to when it goes
Yeah.
against what he's been taught his entire life. So going deeper into what I think is like the power of what really powers this novel is this like devotional father-son relationship. And as you mentioned, the kinds of difficult relationships that we have with those we love, and especially in this father-son bond. We see this dynamic of father and son, both pretty isolated, or at least father goes out in the world but keeps son safe. And the two of them have this like very solo bond together.
Mhm.
And then father wants to assimilate and wants son to assimilate. And then son starts to, and then father goes back into isolation. There's just, again, this dynamic between the two of them where they want what is best for the other, and yet almost
Mm.
never are they, at least what in this book, when we see their relationship, are they on the same page at the exact same time. Could you talk about how you developed this dynamic between them, and maybe a little bit about why it was important for us to see this relationship where they're never quite exactly in line?
Mm. Yeah, that that's so funny. I feel like I'm always making my characters' lives as hard as possible. But yeah, they never like as soon as son starts to understand father more, father just completely changes on him. And I think a reason why I think it's because just with my understanding of how parents have have dealt with their own very traumatic experiences, and how so many of their actions, uh, because I father is deeply influenced by the death of his wife, which
Mhm.
I only show in glimpses, these very dreamlike glimpses about what happened to his wife and what happened in the real world. There are these glimpses, and father just, I think, from what I've seen from my experiences, where he just overcorrects constantly. Since I wasn't able to protect my wife, now I'm gonna go just completely overboard and keep my son safe, control everything about son's life, and keep him in the mansion as a way to keep him safe.
Mhm.
And then he realized that he just overdid that, and then he overcorrects again by pushing son harshly into the world, and and it just becomes this cycle where he is just feeling so much guilt for constantly overcorrecting and overdoing it. And what happened, and I think at some point, with the shadows with the shadows that come in at the second half, I think he just reaches the point where he's like, I everything I try to do is just seems to create more harm, and he does one final overcorrection by just isolating himself, and just stops taking action completely, because he feels like any action he takes just overdoes it. And so I think a part of me and a part of my characters is they just are always going to the extreme. They just never, kind of like how Sun is, how Sun is so derangedly optimistic he gets that from his father, who just has a one goal and just completely goes overboard with it. And you know.
Yeah. No, I love like the idea of writing and being drawn to writing characters who are extreme in a certain way, because I do think that that leads to really compelling story, which, yeah, these two very extreme characters really go through a lot of extreme things throughout the book. You mentioned the shadows that start to lurk in this world, and they're representative of a lot of these ghosts' bad memories. Um, and then, you know, don't want to give too many spoilers, but memory plays a pretty strong role in this book. And in the story, good and bad memories. There's a way to like overpower the shadows. And that's something that father does for these ghosts, and that son does, we see son do on one occasion. I'm curious how you think about memory in your work, and how it plays out both in this book and also in your poetry. Because what's very interesting in this book is that most of these characters, if not all of them, do not actually have any access to memory. There's very little flashback, or like you mentioned, there's not that much shown about mother who died in the land of the living. How do you think about memory's role in your work?
Yeah, thank you so much. I memory, it I just remember being a child, and where I would just see my parents doing these strange, difficult things, sometimes taking violent action, and it would be very confusing. I was just very confused. But then as I grew older, I realized that certain memories were haunting them, and they didn't even realize it themselves was the thing. It I think that's maybe a core element of traumatic memories, where you feel the emotions of the memory and they cause you to do to take certain actions, but you're not aware that it's but you're not aware of those memories themselves. It's just the emotions from the memories that are still impacting you. And so that has really affected a lot of my work. Trying to capture the confusion that a narrator feels around a loved one who is being haunted by something, but but the narrator doesn't know what they're being haunted by, and that loved one doesn't know what they're being haunted by
Mhm.
too. And so the not knowing just creates this very charged, violent atmosphere, because they're so angry at the fact that they don't understand why um, that this is happening. And um, yeah, and yeah, and I think that's why I'm very I only give glimpses of the memory, and the ending is basically one big charged memory, but Sun doesn't really understand the memory. But I only just give a glimpse because that's how it's always been, for me too, where because my parents and I don't talk that much, but they and yet and yet I've seen so much violence and so much pain from them, and it's always made me very confused. And it but we don't but they don't, when I do talk to them, they don't understand. They just tell me I don't know. I don't know why it's like that. I don't know why I'm feeling this way. Um and it and to me it's been a lifelong process of accepting that, like, where I'm not gonna they are not gonna have answers to why they're acting in a certain way. They're not gonna have access to those memories because it was hard for them. And I'm not gonna have access. to those memories either. So I just have to learn to be patient and um, and accept accept the not knowing.
Hmm. I think what you do so beautifully and so well in this book is kind of replicate and represent that feeling through the story. There's so much mystery and ambiguity around Sun's understanding of the world and therefore the reader's understanding of the world. And there's um, this, there are just like so many questions popping up, and some of them do get answered, but not all of them. And to me, there's this pleasure in that not knowing when I'm reading, and there's a pleasure in ambiguity. So I guess this is kind of going back to that craft level of how you know when to reveal and what to
Oh,
reveal in order to, I guess, almost like expertly recreate that feeling that you're describing.
wow, yeah. When to know. Actually, I really struggled. I really struggled. I after I turned in the book, I actually felt like I felt like I didn't reveal enough, or I felt like I held back too much. I mean, I think every author is like that. I could have changed this. I could have changed it. Blah, blah, blah. But it was a big struggle. I think to me, it seemed, and to me, I just felt like I think you eventually I just built an instinct on the atmospheric level, and to me, it was just enough to hint at the fact that the mother was sick,
Mhm.
and and her sickness really has affect and her death really affected them in a very dramatic way. I thought that was enough. I felt like if I talked too more, then the then the voice would be completely pierced. I don't know that the voice. If Sun knew too much, he just wouldn't be wrestling as much with um with the mystery of this world, and so a lot of it I felt like was just presenting images and symbols of disease and sickness, but not actually commenting too much on those images and symbols.
Yeah. And I love how we never really figure out like who this friend, like this person who father like has his
Yeah.
connection with in the world. He's like this mysterious figure who like helps Madame. I just love
Oh
I
my
love
God.
so much of it. I do want to take a moment just to see if there are any audience questions that may pop up. If you do have them, you can put them in the Q&A section. I'm sure Nghiem would be very happy to answer. And I will ask one final question as we just wait and see if there are any questions from participants. One element that I'm just like, I love this, I love that. Sun reads a lot. He loves books, and he he just like reads books for the stories, and he's like, these stories are enough to fuel me, and I don't need the ghosts, I don't need friends, whatever. I have my books. And then these books shift also throughout the book. They at one point they get destroyed and all the pages get ripped out. At another point he opens them and there are no words in them. And then at another point he like goes to the books and they just like have lost their power over him. The stories feel less meaningful. um and I just felt like this was a really wonderful representation of like almost the way that stories and especially fiction plays out in our lives. Sometimes it just like sustains us and sometimes not at all. And sometimes it loses its meaning. I guess I'm just curious, like what compelled you to include Sun's obsession with reading, and how did you see it working in the book?
Oh my gosh. I think that was again is a little autobiographical um manifestation just because I learned English when I was 7, and it was a very it was just a very bizarre time where I would just be given these books of English and I would have to look at them, and it's just I don't and the words is just were just I don't be floating in the air to me because I literally am I have no clue what is happening. And so that's a moment why I've always wanted to include things about words disappearing from books, words floating around in books. And I think it was on a practical level. The he since he is so alone, he can only understand the world through books, and so the books represent so much of the limits of his knowledge. And so I just really wanted to mess with him. Like as an
Yeah.
author, I love messing with my characters. I just love making them stress out. And so that since the books are so important to him, I just thought it'd be so fun to just mess with him by like ripping up the books and making the words disappear. I knew that would get a good reaction out of my narrator. So a lot of my craft decisions have to go with that. What are my narrator's deepest weird fears?
Mm,
And so now let me just write that scene and see what happens.
I love that. I love messing with my characters, Nghiem Tran. All right. Well, thank you so, so much for answering all of my questions. I know that you have an exit reading to share with everyone. So I will mute myself and turn off my camera for your final reading.
I have a prose poem, a short one. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'm really grateful. My father was an angel. He grew wings. He flew into the sky. My mother said he was in America now. We had to wait until he calls for us. And then will we grow wings too, I asked? Will we be able to fly into the sky? My mother said my father would be gone for a long time. We would have to earn a lot of money to afford our visas. I should try to forget about him. But how could I forget an angel? I ran up to the roof. I stared at the big, nightmarish clouds. I was disappointed. A cloud slipped down my throat, and inside my chest, melancholy would stay for the rest of my life, occasionally cracking with lightning and drenching my soul in rain. My father did not descend from the sky. I did not get to touch his strong, brilliant wings. He did not give me one of his feathers to remember him by. And so eventually I had to leave the roof. I descended back toward Earth on the stairs of the apartment building. I went to school, I returned home, I wandered the streets of the city, searching for the divine. Instead, the air was polluted and dust reddened my eyes. I started to cry. Then suddenly the world was made of water. I wiped my eyes, and the world was warm and dry again. The sun sang of loneliness, and I let the sun burn that song deep into my heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Nghiem, for the wonderful reading. And thank you, Alexandra, for a memorable conversation. And thank you to everyone for joining us. As a reminder, the link to Nghem's book has been posted in the chat. Yeah, have a great night, everyone.